They were told Americans would kill their children first. But when a young Japanese mother stepped off a transport ship in San Francisco, clutching a crying infant against her chest, October 1945, the enemy surrounded her not with rifles, but with open hands reaching toward her baby. She had expected execution. Instead, she found something far more terrifying: American soldiers who wanted to help. Her scream, "Don't touch my baby! I ain't," echoed across the dock and froze every man in place. If you're interested in untold stories from World War II that reveal the human side of history, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. These are the stories that textbooks often miss. The war was over. In Tokyo, in Osaka, in Manila, in cities across the Pacific, Japanese civilians emerged from shelters to find their world in ashes. Emperor Hirohito's voice had crackled over radios announcing surrender, and with it came a terror deeper than any bombing raid. What would the victorious Americans do to them now? The propaganda had been clear and constant throughout the war. American soldiers were demons, barbarians who would show no mercy. Women and children would be the first to suffer. Mothers had been told that if captured, their babies would be torn from their arms and killed. Some had even been given instructions on how to end their children's lives quickly, mercifully, rather than let them fall into enemy hands. Keiko was 23 years old when the war ended. She had been living in Manila with her husband, a supply clerk for the Imperial Japanese Army. Her daughter Yuki was just 8 months old, born in the chaos of February 1945 as American forces closed in on the city. Keiko's husband had been killed in March during the final brutal days of the Battle of Manila. She had survived by hiding in basements with other Japanese civilians, clutching Yuki to her chest, praying the baby wouldn't cry and give away their location. When the Americans finally came, rounding up Japanese civilians for transport, Keiko had prepared herself for death. She wrapped Yuki in the last clean cloth she had, whispered prayers to her ancestors, and waited. But death didn't come. Instead, there were orders barked in English, lines formed, and the bewildering process of being counted, tagged, and loaded onto trucks. The journey to the coast was a blur. Keiko sat in the back of a military truck with dozens of other Japanese women and elderly men, all silent, all terrified. Yuki fussed in her arms, hungry and uncomfortable, but Keiko had no food to give her. Her own body, malnourished from months of near starvation, had stopped producing milk weeks ago. She'd been feeding Yuki watered-down rice paste when she could find any rice at all. At the port, they were loaded onto a transport ship. The vessel was huge, gray, intimidating, a reminder of American military might. Keiko had never been on a ship before. The metal corridors were cold and echoing. The smell of diesel fuel and salt water was overwhelming. Women were separated into groups and led to a cargo hold that had been converted into makeshift quarters. Metal bunks lined the walls, stacked 3 high. The floor was bare steel. American sailors watched them with expressions Keiko couldn't read. Were they angry, curious, disgusted? She kept her eyes down and held Yuki tighter. The baby was crying now, a thin, hungry wail that cut through the noise of the ship. Other mothers tried to soothe their children too. The sound of crying babies filled the hold, a chorus of infant desperation that would haunt Keiko for years. The voyage across the Pacific took 12 days. Keiko lost count after the first week. She existed in a fog of fear and exhaustion. Twice a day, American servicemen brought food, cans of something they called rations. The first time, Keiko refused to eat, certain it was poisoned. But Yuki was starving, and eventually desperation won. She tasted the strange canned meat, the crackers, the powdered milk mixed with water. When she didn't die, she ate more, though guilt gnawed at her with every bite. The milk powder changed everything. One of the American medics showed her how to mix it with warm water and feed it to Yuki in a bottle. The baby drank greedily, and for the first time in months, she seemed satisfied. Keiko wanted to feel grateful, but gratitude felt like betrayal. These were the people who had killed her husband. These were the enemy. How could she accept their kindness? On the 13th day, someone shouted that land was visible. The women crowded toward the small portholes, straining to see. Through the gray morning fog, a coastline emerged. Buildings rose in the distance, tall, intact, untouched by war. This was America. This was the enemy's homeland. As the ship entered San Francisco Bay, Keiko felt her chest tighten. The city spread before them like something from a dream, or a nightmare. Skyscrapers pierced the sky. Cars moved along streets. Lights glowed in windows. It looked nothing like Manila's ruins, nothing like the burned cities of Japan. The contrast was staggering. While her world had been reduced to rubble, the enemy's world stood pristine and powerful. The ship docked, and the order came. Everyone off. The women gathered their meager belongings, nothing more than the clothes they wore and whatever small items they had managed to keep. Keiko wrapped Yuki tightly in her cloth sling, the baby pressed against her heart. She could feel the tiny heartbeat against her chest, rapid and fragile. The gangway led down to a wide dock. American soldiers lined both sides, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They wore clean uniforms, held clipboards, spoke in rapid English. Some were smoking cigarettes, Some were laughing with each other. They looked young, relaxed, utterly in control. Keiko's legs trembled as she stepped onto American soil. The morning air was cool and carried the smell of the ocean mixed with exhaust from trucks. Yuki began to cry again, and several soldiers turned to look. One of them, a young man with red hair and freckles, stepped forward with a smile on his face. "Can I help?" he asked in English, reaching toward the baby. Keiko didn't understand the words, but she understood the gesture. He was reaching for Yuki. They were taking her baby. "Don't touch my baby!" The words burst from her throat in Japanese, raw and desperate. She jerked backward, clutching Yuki so tightly the baby's cry intensified. Every muscle in Keiko's body was rigid with terror. This was it. This was the moment the propaganda had warned about. The soldier froze. His hands were still extended, but now his face showed surprise, then something like hurt. He took a step back. Around them, other soldiers had stopped what they were doing. The dock, which had been buzzing with activity, fell into an awkward silence. An officer pushed through the crowd, an older man with gray at his temples and captain's bars on his collar. He said something sharp to the red-haired soldier, who backed away further, hands raised in a gesture of surrender. The captain then turned to Keiko and spoke slowly, his voice calm but firm. She didn't understand the words, but his tone was clear. "Stay calm. Nobody's going to hurt you." A Japanese-American interpreter appeared, a young woman in an army uniform with sergeant stripes. She approached carefully, her own hands visible and empty. "Nobody wants to take your baby," the interpreter said in careful Japanese. "The soldier just wanted to help. He thought maybe you needed assistance with your child." Keiko stared at her, chest heaving, not daring to believe it. The interpreter gave her a small, sad smile. "I know what you've been told," she said quietly, "but it's not true. Your baby is safe. You're both safe." They were herded, though herded was perhaps too harsh a word, into a processing building near the dock. It was a large warehouse-like structure that had been converted into a temporary reception center. Tables lined the room, each staffed by military personnel with stacks of forms. The smell of coffee filled the air, mixing with the industrial scent of the warehouse. Keiko moved through the line in a daze, Yuki still clutched tightly against her chest. The baby had finally quieted, exhausted from crying. At each station, the interpreter accompanied her, translating questions and instructions. Name, age, place of birth, any family in Japan, any illness. The questions were mundane, bureaucratic, almost boring in their ordinariness. This wasn't interrogation, this was paperwork. Keiko answered mechanically, her mind still racing, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. Then came the medical station. A sign in English read, "Medical Examination," and below it someone had added Japanese characters, "Jiankang Jenduan," Health Inspection. Keiko's stomach dropped. This was where it would happen. This was where they would take Yuki from her. But instead of armed soldiers, she found a middle-aged doctor with kind eyes and a female nurse who smiled warmly. The interpreter explained that they needed to check both Keiko and her baby for any illnesses, any injuries that needed treatment. "You don't have to give her your baby," the interpreter assured her. "The doctor just needs to make sure the child is healthy." Slowly, with trembling hands, Keiko loosened her grip on Yuki. The doctor approached with exaggerated slowness, his movements careful and deliberate. He listened to the baby's heartbeat with a stethoscope, examined her eyes and ears, gently felt her belly. Throughout the examination, he spoke in a soft, soothing tone, though Keiko couldn't understand the words. "She's underweight," the interpreter translated, "but otherwise healthy. We'll make sure you get extra milk formula for her." Then it was Keiko's turn. The nurse checked her pulse, her blood pressure, looked at her eyes and throat. The doctor's expression grew more serious when he examined her. Through the interpreter, he explained that she was severely malnourished and anemic. She would need proper food and rest. "We'll take care of you," the nurse said through the interpreter, and there was genuine concern in her voice. Keiko didn't know how to process this. Where was the cruelty? Where was the punishment? Every moment that passed without violence only deepened her confusion and fear. Kindness from the enemy felt more dangerous than hatred would have. Hatred she understood. This strange compassion was incomprehensible. After processing, they were led to what the Americans called a mess hall. The room was enormous, filled with long tables and benches. At one end, steam rose from behind a counter where military cooks worked. The smell hit Keiko like a physical force. Food, real food, being cooked in quantities she couldn't comprehend. The Japanese women and children were directed to form a line. Keiko watched as the people ahead of her received metal trays, then moved down the counter as cooks spooned food onto their plates. When her turn came, a large black soldier smiled at her and said something cheerful in English before loading her tray with scrambled eggs, toast, some kind of meat, and fruit. Actual fruit, a sliced orange that glowed like gold. Then the cook added another bottle of prepared formula, already mixed and ready for Yuki. He pointed to the baby and gave Keiko a thumbs up. She stared at the bottle in disbelief. She found a seat at one of the long tables, setting the tray down carefully as if it might vanish if she moved too quickly. Around her, other Japanese women were having the same experience, staring at plates filled with more food than they had seen in months, maybe years. Some were crying. Others sat frozen, unable to move. One elderly woman near Keiko picked up a piece of toast, examined it closely, then bit into it. Tears streamed down her weathered cheeks as she chewed. "Real bread," she whispered in Japanese. "It's real bread." Keiko fed Yuki first. The baby drank hungrily from the bottle, her small hands waving in contentment. Watching her daughter eat filled Keiko with a complex mixture of relief, joy, and crushing guilt. For 8 months she had struggled to feed this child. She had watched Yuki grow thinner, her cries grow weaker, and had felt like a failure as a mother. Now in enemy hands, her baby was finally getting the nutrition she desperately needed. When Yuki finished and dozed off, Keiko turned to her own food. She picked up the fork, a real metal fork, and pierced a piece of scrambled egg. It was warm, seasoned, perfectly cooked. She put it in her mouth and her eyes immediately filled with tears. The taste was almost overwhelming. For so long she had eaten whatever scraps she could find, moldy rice, vegetable peelings, once even tree bark ground into paste. This was real food, prepared with care, offered freely. She ate slowly, trying to make it last, trying to memorize this feeling because surely it couldn't last. Across the table, a young mother about her age was openly sobbing as she ate. Another woman had given up trying to eat and was just sitting with her face in her hands. The weight of relief was almost as crushing as the weight of fear had been. An American officer walked through the mess hall, observing. He stopped near Keiko's table and said something to his companion. Through the ambient noise, Keiko heard the interpreter nearby translate for someone else. "Make sure all the mothers with infants get extra formula, and someone check if we have any diapers available." Diapers. They were thinking about diapers. The enemy was concerned about whether Japanese babies had clean diapers. Keiko looked down at Yuki, sleeping peacefully in her arms, her tiny belly finally full. Then she looked at her own half-empty plate, at the orange slices she hadn't yet touched, at the other women around her slowly beginning to accept this strange new reality. The contradiction was almost unbearable. How could the monsters of propaganda be the same people who worried about baby formula and diapers? After the meal, they were transported by bus to what the Americans called a relocation center. The name was ironic. This had been one of the camps where Japanese Americans were interned during the war. Now it was being repurposed to house Japanese nationals awaiting repatriation to Japan. The cruel irony wasn't lost on the interpreter, who explained the situation with visible discomfort. The camp was located inland, surrounded by scrubland and distant mountains. Rows of wooden barracks stretched across the dusty ground, organized in neat blocks. Guard towers stood at the corners, but Keiko noticed that they were unmanned. The fence that surrounded the camp was there, but it wasn't heavily fortified. This wasn't a prison designed to hold dangerous criminals. It was a temporary holding facility. Keiko was assigned to Barrack 7, Room C, a small space about 12 feet square that she would share with 2 other mothers and their children. The room was sparse but clean. 3 metal frame beds with mattresses, thin but present, 3 small lockers, a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, 1 window with a screen. But what shocked Keiko most was what waited on each bed: folded sheets, a blanket, a pillow. On the locker next to what would be her bed, there was a small stack of supplies: cloth diapers, safety pins, a bar of soap, a towel, and another can of powdered milk formula. She stood in the doorway, unable to move. One of her roommates, a woman named Midori, who was perhaps 30 years old with a toddler son, picked up the soap and held it to her nose. "It smells like flowers," she whispered, and Keiko heard the wonder in her voice. The third woman, Tomoko, younger and heavily pregnant, sat on her bed and began to cry quietly. "Why are they doing this?" she asked no one in particular. "Why are they being kind?" It was the question on everyone's mind. Keiko set Yuki down on the bed and began to organize their few belongings. The baby immediately started to fuss, so Keiko picked her up again, bouncing her gently. A knock on the door made all 3 women freeze. It was the interpreter from earlier, accompanied by a young American nurse carrying a bag. The interpreter smiled. "The nurse wanted to check on all the mothers with very young infants," she explained in Japanese. "She's brought some additional supplies." The nurse, whose name tag read Williams, began unpacking the bag. More formula, bottles, actual rubber nipples to replace the improvised ones, a thermometer, a tube of something the interpreter called diaper rash cream, small undershirts for babies. She distributed these items among the 3 women, speaking in English with the interpreter translating. "If you need anything, especially for the children, you can ask," Nurse Williams said through the interpreter. "We want to make sure all the babies are healthy and comfortable." After they left, the 3 women sat in stunned silence. Midori was the first to speak. "My husband told me the Americans would throw our children into fires," she said quietly, her voice hollow. "He made me promise that if we were captured, I would I would spare our son that fate. She looked at her sleeping toddler and fresh tears rolled down her face. I almost did it. When the soldiers came, She couldn't finish, but she didn't need to. They all understood. They had all been prepared to do the unthinkable to protect their children from a fate that, so far, showed no signs of materializing. That night, lying on a real mattress with a real pillow, listening to Yuki's soft breathing beside her, Keiko stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of it all. Every kindness was an assault on everything she had been taught to believe. Every gesture of compassion cracked the foundation of her understanding of the world. She thought of the red-haired soldier on the dock, the one who had just wanted to help. She thought of his face when she screamed at him, the surprise, the hurt, the immediate retreat. He hadn't been reaching for Yuki to harm her. He had been reaching to help. The realization should have brought relief. Instead, it brought a new kind of terror. If the enemy wasn't what she had been told, then what else had been a lie? The days fell into a rhythm that felt surreal in its ordinariness. Each morning at 7 o'clock, a bell rang to signal breakfast. The mess hall opened, and the smell of coffee and cooked food would drift across the camp. Keiko learned to wake before the bell so she could feed and change Yuki in the relative quiet of early morning. Breakfast was always substantial. Eggs, rice or bread, sometimes fruit, always milk for the children. The American cooks seemed to take special care with the mothers and children, often adding extra portions without being asked. One cook, a heavy-set man with a thick mustache, would always make silly faces at Yuki when Keiko came through the line, delighted when the baby gave him a toothless smile. After breakfast, those who were able were assigned to light work duties. The Americans made it clear that mothers with infants were exempt, but many women chose to volunteer anyway, partly to contribute, partly to have something to do with their hands, partly to earn the small amount of camp script that could be used at the canteen. Keiko was assigned to help in the camp laundry 3 mornings a week. The work was easy, almost meditative, washing, hanging, folding. The laundry was run by an older Japanese-American woman named Mrs. Tanaka, who had been hired by the camp administration. She was kind but matter-of-fact, treating the internees with a mixture of sympathy and practicality. "The Americans don't know what to do with you," Mrs. Tanaka explained one morning while they folded sheets. "The war is over, but Japan is devastated. They can't send you back until things stabilize there. So for now, you wait here. But I'll tell you this. You could do worse than wait here. My family spent 3 years in this camp during the war. We had less freedom than you do, and the same amount of food." The camp had a small canteen that opened twice a week. With the scrip earned from work, internees could buy small luxuries: soap, toothpaste, candies, notebooks and pencils, simple toys for children. Keiko used her first earnings to buy a small notebook and a pencil. She wanted to record this experience, to write letters to family members in Japan if they were still alive, to have some way of processing the surreal reality she was living. The most surprising aspect of daily life was the medical care. A camp doctor visited twice a week, and a nurse was on duty every day. They didn't just treat emergencies, they conducted regular checkups, especially for the children and pregnant women. When Yuki developed a mild cough, Nurse Williams came immediately, examined her thoroughly, and provided medicine. She returned the next day to check on her progress. "In Manila, when Yuki was sick, I prayed to every god I could think of," Keiko wrote in her notebook one evening. "I had no medicine, no doctor, no help. I could only hold her and hope. Here I mention a cough, and within an hour a nurse is at my door with medicine and concern. How do I reconcile these two realities?" Letters began arriving from Japan in the 3rd week. The camp administration had established a mail system, coordinating with Red Cross offices to help internees contact surviving family members. The letters that came back painted a picture of devastation that made the relative comfort of the camp feel even more surreal. Keiko received a letter from her mother, who had survived the war in their hometown of Hiroshima. She had been visiting relatives in the countryside when the atomic bomb fell and had escaped the worst of it. But the letter's contents were harrowing. "Our city is gone. Everything is gone. We are living in a shelter made from scraps of metal. There's barely any food. Your father is sick, I think from the bomb, though he was not in the city when it fell. People are dying every day from sickness, from starvation, from despair. If you are alive, if you are reading this, know that I am grateful. But I cannot imagine where you are or what has happened to you. Your brother's widow and her children are with us. The children cry from hunger every night. We have nothing to give them." Keiko read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and put it away. That evening at dinner she stared at her plate: pot roast, potatoes, carrots, bread, a small salad, and a glass of milk. The milk alone was more nutrition than her nephews and nieces were getting in a week. She couldn't eat. The guilt was physically suffocating. She wrapped the bread in a napkin, thinking she could somehow send it to her mother, before realizing how absurd that was. She couldn't send food through a letter. All she could send were words, and what words could possibly bridge the gap between her mother's reality and her own? Other women in the camp were receiving similar letters. The common area would sometimes echo with quiet weeping as women read news from home. They shared stories in hushed voices, cities in ruins, family members dead or missing, widespread starvation, disease, despair. And then they would go to the mess hall and be served 3 full meals a day. They would take their children to the camp clinic and receive free medical care. They would sleep in beds with clean sheets, wash with soap, drink clean water. The contradiction was crushing. "We are prisoners," Midori said one evening as they sat in their shared room. "But we live better than we did when we were free. We live better than our families in Japan live now. What kind of captivity is this?" Tomoko, whose baby was due in 2 months, spoke quietly. "My mother wrote that there are no hospitals functioning in Tokyo. Women are giving birth in ruins, with no doctors, no medicine. She said many mothers and babies are dying." She placed her hands on her swollen belly. "Here, I see a doctor every week. They're planning for my delivery. They've promised me a hospital, medicine if I need it, care for my baby. How can I hate people who are trying to save my child's life?" But hatred would have been simpler. Hatred would have made sense. This confused gratitude mixed with guilt, mixed with grief, mixed with anger at a situation they couldn't control. This was far more difficult to bear. Despite the language barrier, small moments of human connection began to emerge between the internees and their American guards and staff. These moments were often awkward, sometimes uncomfortable, but undeniably real. Private James Morrison was a 20-year-old soldier from Iowa who had been assigned to the camp after serving in the Philippines. He had seen combat, had lost friends, and should have had every reason to view the Japanese internees with hatred. Instead, he became known for his gentleness with the children. Every afternoon, Morrison would make his rounds past the family barracks, and he always carried a pocketful of Tootsie Rolls. At first, the Japanese mothers wouldn't let their children take the candy. Who knew what it might contain? But after a few weeks, when it became clear that the children who did take the candy suffered no ill effects beyond sticky fingers and sugar rushes, resistance crumbled. Morrison learned a few words of Japanese. "Hello. How are you? Baby. Pretty." His pronunciation was terrible, and the women would sometimes giggle behind their hands at his mangled attempts. But his efforts were genuine, and eventually the giggles became smiles, and the smiles became tentative waves. One afternoon, Morrison stopped by when Keiko was sitting outside her barrack, trying to soothe the fussy Yuki in the warm sunshine. He approached slowly, holding out a Tootsie Roll and saying something in English. Keiko shook her head and pointed to Yuki. "Baby. Too small," she said in halting English, words she had picked up from listening to others. Morrison's face lit up at her attempt to communicate. He nodded and pocketed the candy, then pulled out a small photograph from his wallet. It showed a young woman holding an infant. "My wife," he said, pointing to the woman. "My daughter," pointing to the baby. Then he pointed to Yuki and gave a thumbs up, his smile broad and genuine. In that moment, something shifted in Keiko's chest. This young soldier was a father, too. He was thousands of miles from his own baby daughter, showing pictures to an enemy mother because it was the only way he could feel close to his family. The war had taken him from his child, just as it had taken Keiko's husband from Yuki. Keiko pointed to the photo and then to Morrison. "Beautiful, beautiful baby," she said, using more of her limited English. Morrison's eyes got suspiciously bright. He nodded, smiled, carefully put the photo away, and continued his rounds. But after that, he always stopped to check on Yuki, to make faces that made the baby laugh, to share a moment of connection that transcended war and language and politics. There were other moments, too. The cook who always added extra fruit to Keiko's tray. The nurse who brought her own daughter's outgrown baby clothes to donate to the internees. The camp administrator who approved extended family visitation hours after several women expressed how much they missed having family time with their children in a normal setting. Not all interactions were positive. Some soldiers maintained cold distance. Some staff members were curt or dismissive. There was one guard who seemed to take pleasure in being unnecessarily strict about minor rules. But these were the exceptions, not the rule, and that fact was perhaps the most disorienting thing of all. The propaganda had painted all Americans as monsters. The reality was much more complicated. They were people. Some kind, some indifferent, some still carrying their own grief and anger from the war, but fundamentally human in all their complexity. At night, after Yuki fell asleep, Keiko would write in her notebook by the dim light of the single bulb in their room. The writing was her way of trying to process the impossible contradictions of her situation. Her entries grew longer and more anguished as the weeks passed. November 15th, 1945. Today Yuki smiled at Private Morrison. She actually smiled at him, reached for him with her tiny hands. She doesn't know he's American. She doesn't know he's supposed to be the enemy. To her, he's just a kind face that makes funny expressions. But I know. I know what he represents. I know his country killed my husband. I know his bombers destroyed my city. And yet when he shows me pictures of his own daughter and I see the love in his eyes, I cannot hate him. What kind of wife am I? What kind of Japanese woman am I? My husband died fighting these people, and here I am accepting their food, their medicine, their kindness. Is this survival or is it betrayal? November 22, 1945. Tomoko's baby came early. They rushed her to a real hospital in the city. A real American hospital, with real doctors and medicine and everything they needed. She was in labor for 18 hours. They gave her medicine for the pain. They gave her blood when she started bleeding too much. They saved her life and her baby's life. The baby is a boy. He is healthy and strong. Tomoko cried when she saw him, cried so hard she couldn't speak. When she came back to the camp 3 days later, she said something that I cannot stop thinking about. My son is alive because of American doctors. My son's first breath was taken in America. I named him Takeshi. It means warrior, because he fought to live. But I also gave him an American middle name, James, after the doctor who saved us. I don't know what to think about this. Is she a traitor, or is she simply a mother who is grateful that her child is alive? December 3rd, 1945. I received another letter from my mother. Things are worse in Hiroshima. My father died. She wrote 3 sentences about it, as if she has no more words left for grief. She said he simply stopped eating, stopped wanting to live. She said many people are doing the same, dying not from wounds or sickness, but from despair. I sat with that letter for hours. Then I went to the mess hall and watched Yuki eat. She has gained weight, her cheeks are full, her eyes are bright, she is thriving. If we were in Japan right now with my family, we would probably both be dead. Instead, we are here and we are alive. I am grateful. I am so deeply grateful. And I hate myself for feeling grateful to the people who destroyed my country. The other women struggled with similar conflicts. Late-night conversations in their barracks circled endlessly around the same questions. How do we accept kindness from the enemy? How do we reconcile what we were taught with what we're experiencing? How do we live with the guilt of surviving comfortably while our families suffer? Midori, who had nearly killed her own son to spare him from American cruelty, spoke one evening with a hollow voice. I looked my son in the eyes, she whispered. I held the cloth in my hands. I was ready to do it, to end his life quickly, mercifully, before the Americans could torture him. I was taught this was love, that this was the act of a good mother. She paused, watching her son sleep peacefully in his bed. Now he is healthy. He is happy. He plays with American soldiers who give him candy and toys. They make him laugh. They are teaching him English words. If I had done what I was prepared to do, I would have murdered my son to protect him from people who wanted to help him. How do I live with that knowledge? The camp became its own small society, with complex social dynamics emerging as the months passed. Some women remained deeply distrustful of the Americans, viewing every kindness as a manipulation or trick. They kept to themselves, spoke only when necessary, counted the days until they could return to Japan. Others, particularly the younger women and those with small children, gradually began to let their guard down. They would smile at the guards, say thank you in English, allow their children to interact with the American staff. This created tension within the Interni community. One afternoon in December, a heated argument broke out in the common area. A woman named Sachiko, who had lost 2 sons in the war, confronted Keiko in front of others. I see you, Sachiko said, her voice shaking with anger. I see you smiling at them. I see you letting your daughter play with the soldier who hands out candy. Have you forgotten what they did? Have you forgotten your husband? The accusation hit Keiko like a physical blow. Other women watched in uncomfortable silence. Keiko felt her face flush with shame and anger. I have not forgotten, Keiko replied quietly. I will never forget. But my daughter is alive. She is healthy. If we were in Japan right now, she would probably be dead. What would you have me do? Let her starve to prove my loyalty to a country that no longer exists? The country still exists, Sachiko snapped. Japan still exists. Does it? Keiko asked, and the question hung in the air like smoke. My mother's letters tell me otherwise. They tell me of ruins and starvation and death. They tell me of a nation that has been destroyed. What loyalty do I owe to that? Midori stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. Sachiko, I understand your anger. I share it. My husband is dead too. But we are mothers. Our first loyalty must be to our children. If accepting help from the Americans means our children survive, then we must accept that help. What good is pride if our children die? The argument didn't resolve anything, but it brought the central conflict into the open. The women were divided, not cleanly, but in the messy way that real people are divided when facing impossible choices. Most existed somewhere in the middle, trying to navigate between survival and loyalty, between gratitude and grief, between pragmatism and principle. The camp administrators were aware of these tensions. The interpreter, Sergeant Hayashi, spoke to Keiko one day while she was working in the laundry. I know this is difficult, Hayashi said. I know you're caught between 2 worlds. My family was too during the war. We were Americans, but we looked Japanese, so we were seen as the enemy. We were locked up in camps like this one. We lost our homes, our businesses, our dignity. But we survived. And after the war, we had to figure out what it meant to be both Japanese and American, to honor our heritage while accepting that America is our home. She paused, folding a sheet carefully. You don't have to choose between grieving for what you've lost and accepting help to survive. You can do both. You can love your country and still eat the food that keeps you alive. You can remember your husband and still smile when an American soldier makes your daughter laugh. These things are not contradictions. They are what it means to be human in an impossible situation. Christmas 1945 brought an unexpected challenge to the camp's internees. The American staff decorated the mess hall with pine branches, paper snowflakes, and a small Christmas tree. They announced that there would be a special Christmas dinner and gifts for all the children. Many of the Japanese women didn't know what to make of this. Christmas wasn't a familiar holiday, though some had encountered it in the Philippines or other places where they had lived. The idea of celebrating an American holiday felt wrong, almost offensive. But their children were excited, feeding off the festive energy of the American staff, and it was hard to deny them that joy. On Christmas Eve, Private Morrison appeared with an armful of wrapped packages. Through Sergeant Hayashi, he explained that he and other soldiers had taken up a collection and bought gifts for all the children in the family barracks. For Yuki, now 9 months old and just learning to sit up on her own, there was a soft stuffed rabbit with floppy ears. Morrison demonstrated how squeezing its paw made it squeak, and Yuki's delighted laugh filled the room. For Midori's son, there was a wooden truck. For Tomoko's newborn, soft blankets and tiny clothes. Keiko watched Morrison play with Yuki, making the rabbit hop across the floor while the baby squealed with joy. She watched other soldiers distributing gifts, their faces showing genuine happiness at the children's reactions. She watched Midori's son zoom his new truck around the floor, making engine noises, completely absorbed in play for the first time in months. And she realized something that took her breath away. These men weren't doing this because they were ordered to. They weren't doing it for propaganda or politics. They were doing it because they wanted to bring joy to children who had suffered. They were doing it because despite the uniforms and the war and the national boundaries, they recognized these Japanese children as simply children who deserved kindness. That evening, Keiko wrote in her notebook, December 24th, 1945. I think I finally understand. The propaganda didn't just lie about American cruelty, it lied about something deeper. It told us that nationality and race made us fundamentally different, that Americans could never see us as fully human, that we could never see them as fully human. But I watch Private Morrison, a young man from a place I've never heard of called Iowa, play with my daughter, and I see that he loves children the same way I do. I see that he misses his own daughter the same way I missed Yuki during the war. I see that he grieves for his dead friends the same way I grieve for my husband. The war tried to make us hate each other by telling us we were different species. But we are not. We are all just humans, trying to survive, trying to protect our children, trying to find meaning in a world that often makes no sense. This is not betrayal of my country. This is recognition of a deeper truth. The Christmas. Dinner was unlike anything the internees had experienced in years. Turkey, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, fresh bread, pies. The children were allowed to stay up late. There was music. Someone had a radio, and American Christmas carols played softly. Some of the guards taught the children simple Christmas songs. Keiko sat with Yuki in her lap, watching the scene unfold around her. It was surreal and bittersweet and complicated. She thought of her family in Hiroshima, who were probably cold and hungry on this December night. She thought of her husband, who would never meet his daughter. She thought of the Japan she had known, which no longer existed. But she also felt Yuki's warm weight against her chest, heard her daughter's laugh, saw her daughter's face light up at the rabbit toy, and she recognized that this moment, this strange, impossible moment of Japanese mothers and American soldiers sharing a meal and a holiday, was its own kind of truth. The war had taught her to hate, but survival was teaching her something different. That hate was exhausting, that humanity persisted even in the darkest times, and that sometimes the bravest thing was to accept help from unexpected places. In February 1946, announcements began appearing on the camp bulletin boards. Repatriation to Japan would begin soon. Ships were being prepared. Lists would be posted. The internees should prepare to return home. The reaction was complex. Some women were overjoyed. Finally, they would see their families again, return to their homeland, rebuild their lives. Others were terrified. They had received letters. They knew what awaited them in Japan: ruins, starvation, disease, chaos. They knew their children, who were now healthy and thriving, would be returning to a place of suffering. Keiko's name appeared on the first list. She would leave in 3 weeks. The night she saw her name, she couldn't sleep. She kept looking at Yuki, who was sleeping peacefully in her crib, a real crib that the camp had provided when Yuki outgrew her basket. The baby was plump and healthy now, with round cheeks and sturdy limbs. Her hair had grown in thick and dark. She was learning to pull herself up, to babble in sounds that almost seemed like words. She was thriving. In Japan, she would be hungry again. There would be no formula, no regular meals, no warm clothes, no medical care. Everything Yuki had gained in these months would be lost. The thought was unbearable. Keiko wasn't alone in these thoughts. The barracks buzzed with whispered conversations. Should we try to delay our departure? Can we request to stay longer? Is there any way to bring our families here instead of going back there? The day before her scheduled departure, Keiko was called to the camp administration building. She brought Yuki with her, as she always did, nervous about what this meeting might mean. Sergeant Hayashi was there, along with the camp administrator, Captain Richardson. Through Hayashi, Captain Richardson spoke. Mrs. Yamamoto, we wanted to speak with you before you leave. We've been corresponding with Red Cross offices in Japan about your family situation. We understand your mother and her household are in severe need in Hiroshima. Keiko's heart sank. Were they going to prevent her from sending money? From trying to help? Captain Richardson continued. We want you to know that we're arranging for your family to receive aid through Red Cross channels. Food, medical supplies, temporary shelter materials. It's not much, but it's something. We thought you should know this before you return. Keiko stared at him, not understanding. Why? She finally asked in her halting English. Why help? Captain Richardson looked uncomfortable, as if he hadn't expected the question. He spoke directly to her, even though she might not understand all the words. Hayashi translated, because the war is over, because you're a mother trying to take care of your child, because your family is suffering through no fault of their own, because it's the right thing to do. Then he added something else, speaking more slowly. My son died at Okinawa, he said quietly. He was 19. Every time I see the children, in this camp I think about him. I think about how the war took him before he could have children of his own. I can't bring him back, but I can make sure other children survive. Japanese, American, children are children. They didn't start this war. They shouldn't pay for it with their lives. In that moment, something inside Keiko finally broke. Not broke like shattering, broke like the breaking of a dam, releasing everything she had been holding back for months. She began to cry, and once she started, she couldn't stop. Great, heaving sobs that shook her entire body. All the grief, all the fear, all the confusion, all the guilt, it poured out of her in waves. This man had lost his son to Japanese soldiers. He had every reason to hate her, to hate all Japanese people. Yet here he was, arranging aid for her family, explaining himself to her, treating her with dignity and respect. I'm sorry, she managed to say through her tears in Japanese. I'm so sorry about your son. Hayashi translated, and Captain Richardson nodded. Thank you, he said simply. Take care of your daughter. Take care of your family. I hope you find peace. As Keiko left the building still crying, she realized that this was the turning point. This was the moment when everything she had been taught about the enemy finally and completely collapsed. The Americans weren't demons. They were people who had also lost, who also grieved, who also hoped that somehow, despite everything, humanity could survive. That night, she wrote one final entry in her notebook before packing it away. February 20th, 1946. Tomorrow I return to Japan. I am terrified. But I'm also changed. The war tried to teach me that Americans were monsters, and that I should hate them with every fiber of my being. Instead, Americans taught me something else. That even enemies can choose compassion over cruelty. That even after terrible loss, people can choose to help rather than hurt. That humanity is stronger than propaganda. I will tell Yuki about this someday. I will tell her about the soldiers who protected her when her own country's propaganda told me I should kill her rather than let her fall into their hands. I will tell her about Captain Richardson, who helped my mother even though Japanese soldiers killed his son. I will tell her that the world is more complicated than we're taught, that people are more complex than we're told, and that sometimes the most important lesson is learning that your enemy is human too. The morning of departure was gray and cold. The women gathered in the camp's central yard, their few belongings packed into bags provided by the camp administration. Each mother received a care package for the journey: formula, food, diapers, basic medicines, blankets. They were also given larger packages to take with them, supplies from the Red Cross to help their families in Japan. Private Morrison appeared one last time, his eyes red-rimmed. He gave Yuki the stuffed rabbit she had received at Christmas. For the journey, he said through Sergeant Hayashi. Then he pressed a photograph into Keiko's hand, the one of his wife and daughter that he had shown her months ago. On the back, he had written in careful English, "May all our children know peace." Keiko couldn't speak. She bowed deeply, a gesture of respect and gratitude that transcended language. Morrison bowed back, awkwardly but sincerely. The buses came to transport them to the port. As they drove through San Francisco one last time, Keiko looked out at the city, intact, prosperous, alive. She thought about the cities in Japan that looked nothing like this anymore. She thought about the long road ahead, the challenges of rebuilding a nation from ashes, but she also thought about what she had learned here, about humanity persisting in the most unexpected places, about the choice to show compassion even to enemies, about the strength required to help rather than harm, even when hate would be easier. The ship that took them back to Japan was a military transport that had been converted to carry repatriates. It was crowded and uncomfortable, nothing like the relative comfort of the camp, but the women had care packages, medicine for sick children, and something perhaps more valuable, the knowledge that they and their children would not have to face starvation immediately upon arrival. When they arrived in Japan in March 1946, the devastation was worse than Keiko had imagined. The port city they docked in was a maze of rubble and makeshift shelters. People were thin, gray-faced, moving with the slow energy of the chronically malnourished. Children with hollow eyes watched them disembark. Keiko's mother met her at a Red Cross station 3 days later. The reunion was joyful and heartbreaking at once. Her mother was gaunt, aged decades in the time they had been apart, but she wept with happiness at seeing her daughter alive and at meeting her granddaughter for the first time. "You look well," her mother said, and there was wonder in her voice. "The baby looks healthy." "How is this possible?" Keiko told her. She told her everything about the camp, about the food and medicine, about the American soldiers who helped care for Yuki, about Captain Richardson and Private Morrison, about the care packages and the aid being sent through the Red Cross. Her mother listened in silence, and when Keiko finished, she simply said, "The world is not what we were taught it was." They rebuilt slowly. The aid from the Red Cross helped. Food, medicine, materials for shelter. It wasn't enough to solve everything, but it was enough to survive. Keiko found work with one of the American occupation offices, translating documents, using the English she had learned in the camp. The pay helped feed her extended family. Life was hard. Japan was broken. The recovery would take years, decades even. But they survived. Yuki grew up in post-war Japan, a child of two worlds in a way. Her earliest months had been spent in American care, drinking American formula, receiving American medicine, being smiled at by American soldiers. She had no memory of it, of course, but it had kept her alive. When Yuki was 7 years old enough to understand, Keiko sat her down and told her the story. She showed her the photograph of Private Morrison's family that she had kept all these years. She showed her the stuffed rabbit, worn now from years of love, that had been a Christmas gift from American soldiers. "Why did they help us?" Yuki asked, confused. "If we were enemies?" Keiko thought carefully about how to answer. "Because they chose to see us as people, not just as enemies," she finally said. "Because even in war, even after terrible things have happened, humans can still choose kindness. It doesn't erase the terrible things, but it means that terrible things don't have to be the only story." Years later, Yuki would study in America, earning a degree in international relations. She would dedicate her career to fostering understanding between Japan and the United States. She would often tell people about her mother's experience, about the American soldiers who helped care for her when she was an infant. "My mother always said that the moment that changed her life was when she screamed at the soldier on the dock," Yuki would explain. "She was certain he was going to harm me. Instead, he stepped back. He respected her fear, even though he had the power to ignore it. That moment of respect, of recognizing her humanity even though she was his enemy, that was when she began to understand that everything she had been taught might be wrong." Keiko lived until 2008, dying peacefully at age 86. In her final years, she was interviewed several times by historians studying Japanese civilian experiences in World War II. She always said the same thing. "The Americans didn't defeat us just with bombs. They defeated us with something more powerful. They showed us a different way. They showed us that even enemies can choose humanity over hatred. That lesson changed me more than any weapon ever could." In her belongings after her death, Yuki found the old notebook, the one her mother had written in during those months at the camp. The entries were faded now, the pages yellow with age, but the words were still clear, still powerful. Yuki donated the notebook to a museum, hoping others could learn from her mother's experience. And so the scream, "Don't touch my baby," became more than a moment of terror. It became the beginning of transformation. For Keiko, for the women in that camp, for all those who experienced the strange contradiction of being treated with humanity by their enemies, it was a lesson that propaganda and hatred are not inevitable. The war had tried to teach them that Americans were monsters who would hurt their children. Instead, American soldiers gave their children candy, medicine, care. American doctors saved their lives. American people who had every reason to hate them chose compassion instead. This isn't a simple story of good versus evil. The war was real. The death and destruction were real. Keiko's husband was still dead. Captain Richardson's son was still dead. Cities were still in ruins. The suffering was genuine and deep. But within that tragedy, there were moments of humanity that refused to be extinguished. There were choices made by individuals to help rather than harm, to show compassion rather than cruelty, to recognize the humanity in people they had been taught to see as less than human. For Keiko, the lasting impact was this. She learned that the most powerful force in the world is not hatred, but the courage to extend humanity even to enemies. She learned that propaganda, whether Japanese propaganda about American demons or American propaganda about Japanese savagery, always fails when confronted with actual human connection. As she told her daughter many years later, "I screamed at that soldier because I was terrified he would hurt you. He stepped back because he saw my fear and respected it. In that moment, we were not Japanese and American. We were not enemy and enemy. We were a frightened mother and a young man who understood a mother's love for her child. That moment taught me more about humanity than all the propaganda in the world ever could. This is the story worth remembering, not because it erases the horrors of war, but because it reminds us that even in the darkest times, humans are capable of choosing compassion, that even enemies can recognize each other's humanity, that sometimes the bravest thing is to see past hatred to the person beneath. If this story touched you, if it made you think about how we see our enemies and how propaganda shapes our understanding of others, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We share these forgotten stories from history because they have lessons for today. In a world that still tries to teach us to hate people we've never met, stories like Keiko's remind us that humanity always persists, even in the most unexpected places. Thank you for watching, and remember, choose compassion over cruelty always.